The mansion was quiet that evening, the golden lights dimmed, and the long hallways echoing only the faint sound of a clock ticking somewhere in the distance. And in the center of the grand living room, the billionaire lay back on a couch, eyes closed, his breathing steady as if he had fallen into a deep sleep. But in truth, he was wide awake, carefully listening, carefully waiting, for this was no nap but a secret test he had planned. For he had grown suspicious of everyone around him, never trusting, never believing that anyone could act without hidden intentions. And now his suspicion had reached the new maid, a hard-working woman who came with her small child, a boy who followed her like a shadow, polite, quiet, and yet always observing everything. And the billionaire, who had lived years with walls around his heart, decided he would uncover what kind of child this was. So he pretended to drift off to sleep while the maid busied herself in the kitchen, leaving the boy in the same room, and silence filled the space, broken only by the faint crackle of the fireplace, while the billionaire wondered what would happen next. And in that heavy silence, he heard the soft sound of little feet moving across the carpet, slow, cautious steps as if the child was studying the scene before deciding what to do. And though the man kept his eyes shut, his mind sharpened, curious and tense, imagining that perhaps the child would reach for something expensive. Maybe a watch on the table or the phone beside him, for that is what years of greed around him had taught him to expect, but instead he felt the faint brush of cloth against his arm, and to his shock, the boy had picked up a blanket from the armrest and was gently pulling it over him, smoothing it across his chest with care, far too tender for such small hands. And then, as if to make sure the sleeping man was comfortable, the child gave a small pat on his shoulder, a gesture so innocent and pure that the billionaire, who had not known warmth like this for decades, felt his heart stir, though he kept still, frozen in his role. But deep inside, a storm was building, for the kindness of a child who had so little in life confused him, unsettled him, and above all, pierced through the cold armor he had built around his soul. And as the boy quietly stepped back, sitting on the floor and humming softly to himself as if guarding the man in his slumber, the billionaire found himself fighting an urge to open his eyes and ask why. Why would a child of struggle and poverty show such love to someone who had everything yet gave nothing? But he held back, forcing himself to remain still, because he needed to see more. He needed to understand if this was a fleeting act or a reflection of something deeper. And so he lay there, pretending, while his thoughts raced back to a childhood he had buried under wealth and power, to a time when he too had once been cared for by a stranger who had nothing to gain. And the memory stung him like a wound, reopening, making his chest heavy with an emotion he had long forgotten. And as the night deepened and the mansion grew quieter, he realized that his silent test had already begun to unravel the very walls he had built to keep people out. For what he saw in the child's small act was not only kindness but also a lesson that money could never buy. And though he would not admit it yet, in that moment he knew his life was about to change in ways he could not yet explain. And so he stayed there, eyes closed, pretending to sleep, while a single thought echoed in his mind with haunting clarity. Perhaps it was not the child being tested at all, but him. The billionaire remained perfectly still on the couch, his eyes closed as though lost in a dream, yet his mind was fully awake. Replaying the moment, he felt the blanket pulled gently across his chest by the boy's tiny hands. A gesture so simple and yet so powerful that it stirred something deep inside him, something he thought had died long ago. And though he kept his breathing steady to maintain the illusion of sleep, he could sense the boy sitting close by, his soft humming filling the silence like a melody of innocence. And the billionaire, who had spent years surrounded by people who only wanted something from him, found himself listening intently, wondering what kind of child would act with such care toward a stranger. And slowly, curiosity began to gnaw at him, pushing him to see what the boy would do next. But instead of running around the room or touching anything of value, the child reached into his small pocket and pulled out something, a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges as though carried everywhere. And the billionaire could hear the faint rustle as the boy opened it, whispering words to himself, words that sounded like a prayer or perhaps a letter. And the man's heart tightened, for in that whisper he caught fragments. Thank you, please, keep Mama safe. And though he pretended not to hear, every word struck him with force, leaving him unsettled, because here was a child who owned almost nothing yet carried in his heart more gratitude than any wealthy man he had ever known. And the billionaire, who prided himself on control, felt a strange weakness creep into him, a vulnerability he could not explain. And in that moment, he realized the boy was not just sitting with him, he was guarding him, as though believing the sleeping man needed protection. And when the maid returned quietly from the kitchen, her tired eyes softening at the sight of her son sitting near the couch, she did not scold him or pull him away, but simply placed her hand on his shoulder, whispering gently, "Let him rest." And the boy nodded, carefully folding the paper and slipping it back into his pocket, his gaze still fixed on the man as if ensuring his comfort. And the billionaire, hidden behind closed eyes, felt a lump in his throat, for he could not remember the last time anyone had watched over him without wanting a reward. and as the minutes stretched into an hour, he found himself struggling with a decision to open his eyes and break the act, or to continue the charade and see how far this gentle gesture would go. But something inside told him to wait, because this was more than a test of the maid's child. This was a mirror held up to his own soul, showing him the emptiness he had tried to fill with riches. And in that quiet, with only the fire crackling, and the boy's presence steady beside him, the billionaire realized he was not just pretending to sleep anymore, he was pretending to be the man he had become. Cold and distant, while the truth was that deep down he longed for something as simple and pure as the blanket pulled over him and the whispered prayer of a child who believed in kindness more than in the weight of the world. And though he did not move, a single thought began to burn in his mind. Perhaps the gentle gesture of a child could do what years of wealth and power could not: awaken a heart that had long been asleep. The billionaire lay motionless on the couch, his eyes still closed, though his thoughts raced like a storm. And as the soft murmurs of the boy's whispered prayer echoed in his mind, he found himself pulled toward questions he had never cared to ask before. Questions about who this maid truly was and what kind of life had shaped her son into such a thoughtful child. And though he had employed many workers in his vast estate, he realized he knew almost nothing about her beyond her quiet diligence, and the way she seemed to carry an invisible weight each time she walked through the grand halls. Her eyes lowered but her movements graceful, and as he listened carefully to the faint rustle of her dress as she moved about the living room, he recalled the way she had once paused in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she stared at a small locket around her neck, quickly tucking it back under her blouse as if hiding a secret. And now that image burned in his mind, merging with the boy's folded paper prayer, both pointing toward a past that felt heavy, hidden, and untold. And though he wanted to remain in control of the game he was playing by pretending to sleep, he could not silence the ache of curiosity that pressed harder with each second. For something about the tenderness he had just witnessed did not feel accidental. It felt like the result of a story deeper than he had imagined. And in that moment, he remembered overhearing his staff whisper months ago about the maid's struggles, how she had once lived in a different city, how her husband had disappeared one night and never returned, leaving her with nothing but debts, and a child too young to understand. Yet even then she had not broken. She had worked in silence, never asking for pity. And as the billionaire pieced together those fragments, a strange unease filled him, because her pain reminded him of someone else's own mother, a woman who had spent her entire life raising him after his father abandoned them, a woman who had never shown weakness even when she worked endless shifts just to keep food on the table. And suddenly the memory of her weary eyes collided with the sight of the maid's tired yet resilient face, blurring the line between past and present, between employer and employee, until he could no longer deny that what unsettled him was not only the maid's hidden history, but the way it reflected his own. And as the boy sat protectively near him, the billionaire felt a knot tighten in his chest, for he realized the test he thought he was giving them was instead uncovering truths about himself, truths he had buried under years of wealth and power. And though he wanted to stay still, to keep watching silently, a deeper part of him yearned to open his eyes, to ask her directly about the story behind that locket, about the man she had lost, about how she had managed to raise a boy who carried so much kindness when the world had given her so much pain. But he held himself back, knowing the timing was not right, and instead he let his mind wander deeper into what he had heard, that she had once dreamed of becoming a teacher but had given it up when life demanded she work to survive, that she had endured the cold rejection of relatives who turned away from her when she needed them most, that she had crossed miles with her child just to find a chance at steady work. And though no one had told him all these details directly, the fragments were there in the hushed voices of his staff, in the way she avoided talking about herself, in the lines etched across her face, too young for her age. And as he thought about it all, the billionaire realized that the past she tried so hard to keep hidden was written in every small action she made, every sacrifice she lived. And suddenly, the thought that had haunted him since the blanket was pulled over him grew louder. Perhaps he had misjudged the worth of people all his life, measuring them by their wealth while ignoring the courage it took simply to keep going. And now, as he lay pretending to sleep, he could feel the weight of her story pressing against his own, like two broken threads slowly weaving into something stronger. And though he did not yet know how, he sensed that the maid's uncovered past and the boy's gentle heart were about to change the course of his own future in ways he could never have planned. The billionaire opened his eyes the next morning with a strange heaviness in his chest, one that had nothing to do with lack of sleep but everything to do with what he had witnessed the night before. For no matter how much he tried to brush it aside, he could not stop thinking about the way the maid's child had gently placed that blanket over him and whispered words of protection, as if speaking to someone greater than himself. And as the billionaire sat up in his grand bed, with its silk sheets and golden frame, he realized that for the first time in years, his thoughts were not on business deals, not on money, not on power, but on the quiet kindness of two people who had almost nothing yet carried something he could not buy with all his fortune: genuine care. and as the morning sunlight spilled into the mansion's long hallways, he found himself walking toward the kitchen where the maid was already at work, her hands busy with breakfast. Her son sitting nearby drawing shapes on a scrap of paper. And though he wanted to keep his voice firm, the billionaire surprised himself when he spoke gently, asking her about her night, about her son, about her life. Questions he had never thought to ask before. And though she looked startled at first, her eyes darting upward as if unsure whether it was safe to answer, the kindness in his tone slowly softened her hesitation, and she spoke in small, careful sentences about how her boy loved to read even though they could not afford many books, about how he dreamed of becoming a doctor one day, about how she worried that the world might not give him that chance. And as she spoke, the billionaire felt a quiet tug at his heart, for he had once been a boy with dreams too. A boy who had needed someone to believe in him when the world seemed too harsh, and without realizing it, he pulled a chair closer and listened more. Truly listened, not as a master to a servant but as a man who recognized another soul's struggles. And the more she shared, the more he felt a bond forming, fragile but real. And soon he began talking to you, speaking of his own childhood, of a mother who had sacrificed everything for him, of nights when they had gone hungry but she had still smiled so he would not lose hope. And for the first time in many years he let his guard fall, his words carrying cracks of emotion he rarely allowed anyone to hear. And as the boy listened, his wide eyes shining, he suddenly leaned forward and said softly that his mother was just like that too, strong even when life was cruel. And the billionaire froze, because in that moment, the invisible wall between them crumbled, replaced by an unexpected bond built on shared pain and respect. And though they came from worlds that could not have been more different, they found themselves united by something far stronger than wealth or status, by the endurance of love and sacrifice. And as the day passed, the billionaire noticed how his mansion, once cold and silent despite its size, seemed alive with a new warmth, the sound of the boys' laughter echoing down the halls, the maid's soft humming filling the spaces that had long felt empty. And for reasons he could not fully explain, he began to feel at peace in their presence, as if the hollowness he had carried for years was slowly being filled, not by riches, not by success, but by human connection. And yet, even as this bond grew stronger, there was still suspense in the air. For deep inside, the billionaire wondered what it meant for his future, for theirs, for the delicate line that still separated master from servant. And though he did not yet have an answer, he knew one thing with certainty, that his life was no longer the same as it had been before the night he pretended to sleep. For what he had witnessed had awakened something inside him, something that whispered he was standing at the edge of a change far greater than anything he had ever imagined. The billionaire sat in his study that night, staring at the fire that danced in the grand fireplace. Yet his mind was far from the flames, because his thoughts kept circling back to the maid and her child, the way their presence had brought life into his cold home, and the way he had felt something stir inside him that he could not ignore. And though he was a man used to making quick decisions in business, this felt different, heavier, for it was not about profit or contracts but about people, about feelings, about change. And as he sat there, he realized he stood at a crossroad where one choice could keep things as they were, comfortable, safe, distant, while the other could open a door to something unknown, something he could not fully control but something that already felt important. And so the next morning when he walked into the kitchen and saw the maid carefully packing food for her son's school lunch, he cleared his throat and asked her to sit down, his voice steady though his heart beat faster than he expected. And she looked up with surprise, because billionaires rarely asked maids to sit. Yet his eyes carried no arrogance, only a quiet sincerity. That made her obey, and as her son watched curiously, the billionaire explained that he had seen enough to know she was more than just a worker, that her child was more than just another boy running through the halls, that they had touched something inside him he thought long buried. And he admitted that his life, for all its wealth, had felt empty, cold, and meaningless until their presence showed him the warmth of simple love. And as his words hung in the air, the maid lowered her eyes, overwhelmed, unsure if she could trust what she heard, for life had taught her to be careful with promises. But then he leaned forward and said that he wanted to help, not as a master, showing pity, but as a man offering respect. And he offered to sponsor her son's education fully, to give him the chance to chase his dream of becoming a doctor, to open doors that otherwise might stay shut. And at that moment, the boy's eyes widened in disbelief, while the maid's hands trembled as she whispered that she did not want charity, that she worked to stand on her own feet. But the billionaire gently interrupted and told her it was not charity but an investment in a boy's future, and a gesture of gratitude for the kindness that had shaken him awake from his lonely life. And as silence settled between them, the maid realized his sincerity, and her tears slipped down silently, tears of relief and hope she had buried for years. And the boy ran to hug her, whispering that maybe his dream was no longer impossible. And the billionaire felt his chest tighten with something he had not felt in years, joy, pure and real. And from that day forward, the mansion changed. No longer just a palace of gold and glass, but a home where laughter lived, where meals were shared, where respect replaced hierarchy. and though outsiders might still see them as a billionaire, a maid, and her child, inside those walls they were something else entirely, three souls bound by trust, kindness, and second chances. And as the days turned into weeks, the bond deepened, with the boy slowly becoming like a son the billionaire never had, asking questions, learning lessons, and bringing light to places once filled only with shadows. And the maid, though still humble, began to hold her head higher, no longer just a servant but a woman valued for her strength, her compassion, her resilience. And, though the billionaire still faced the same world of ruthless business and endless wealth outside his gates, he now returned each evening not to silence but to warmth, and each time he watched the boy study with determination. Each time he heard the maid's soft voice filling the home with comfort. He felt certain that this was the real treasure he had been searching for all his life, and yet, deep within him, a quiet suspense remained. For he knew that the world would not understand, that people might question his choices, that others might doubt his motives, but he no longer cared, because what mattered was the truth in his heart, and the truth was that he had found a new family, not by blood but by bond. And that discovery had given him something more valuable than all the riches. He owned a new chapter, a new purpose, and a new chance to live a life that finally felt alive.